Hey everyone, in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenburg back on the show, and we're going to be talking about Microsoft Copilot M365 and how Copilot could potentially surface information that an end user probably shouldn't have access to. This is of course done through misconfigured permissions, but we're going to talk about how tenants get in that condition where there may be misconfigured permissions, and more importantly, what you can do about it before you enable Copilot for any of the users in that tenant. So that and lots more in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I'm joined by one of our very frequent co-hosts. I've got Paul Schnackenburg with me. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. We've got a very interesting topic today, and it's a topic that I think a lot of people are probably curious about. It kind of has a foot in that AI world. And I mean, we can't have a conversation about security for the last year without mentioning AI, surprise, in some way, shape, or form, right? But we're going to, I guess, be a little bit more granular today in that we're going to focus specifically on Microsoft Copilot. Right, which is readily available in 365 and several other places. I'm not sure if Copilot's available everywhere Microsoft has said it's going to be available yet, but it certainly is rolling out, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And there are lots of Copilots, and I really like the name Copilot, but I think Microsoft is going to have some explanation to do because there's lots of Copilots. Some of them cost no money and you can use them and they're great. And some of them cost quite a bit of money and you can use them, but you've got to have the license first. So honestly, it's going to be a lot of education going forward. That's for sure.
For sure. I think don't quote me on this, but I think I saw that the M365 Copilot, at least in the US, was $40 a month or something along those lines from what 30. I saw.
It's
30.
It's
okay.
$30 a month, and I think this goes across all different SKUs. Don't ask me if you're a big business, it might be different. But at least for all the SMBs, you have to pay for a year. You can't just license it for a month and to test it out and then go, okay, now it's not for us. We're gonna leave it. You have to pay for a year, which I literally did just over a week ago and bought myself one Copilot for Microsoft 365 license, and you pay for a year. You can pay for 3 years and you don't get any discount. It's not like you get 10% off if you pay 3 years ahead. No, you're still you're still paying the same price. So that's it. So it's
an interesting choice.
I think that Microsoft, now the world's most valuable company, having put Apple back in their place, I suppose would be the word. I think they're riding high on the Copilot wave, and they're going to maximize the revenue opportunity in the new technology.
Yeah, I would say that's probably pretty accurate. It's certainly looking that way because you would think going with a 3-year SKU, like you would be given that little incentive to buy in for 3 years, right? But interesting choice. It'll be interesting to see how many people opt for the 36-month. Yeah. Anyway, interesting choice.
Yeah.
So
I don't think Microsoft is ever going to tell us, but yes.
Right. So I guess for the purposes of this episode, Paul, to start with, maybe we've kind of talked about what Copilot is a little bit, but I want to answer the major question is like, how is it different from other LLMs that are out there? And the big thing that really stands out to me, and this has been the big concern with LLMs since they've been a huge thing in society for the last year, and that is, how do I make sure that the LLM is not training on data that either I don't want it to, or that people outside of my company are somehow gaining access to my data that is being used inside of the LLM. Like, right, that's always been a concern, is that area of data privacy with LLMs. And Copilot kind of addresses it, because the way I've been describing it is it kind of creates a walled garden, right? Like, hey,
Yep.
here is your LLM, here's your generative AI for your business, and it is trained on and works with the data inside of your Microsoft Cloud tenant.
Yeah, and this is a question that very, very often comes up. So let's finish off the last little bit we talked about. We are going to focus on Copilot for Microsoft 365 in this conversation. There are a bunch of other Copilots. There's Copilot from Dynamics, Copilot in Power BI, Copilot for Security, still in private preview, paid for private preview. It's a bunch of other Copilots. But for this conversation, although you can generalize this to all the others, really. The main difference is this, and this is what people are often confused about. Even with OpenAI's ChatGPT and any of the other sort of public large language model AI models that you're using, they are not changing those models, right? Like if you OpenAI ChatGPT 4.0 Turbo, and you're asking it questions, it's not taking that text and then training the model to make version Turbo Plus next month, right? Like, that is not how that works. However, so the language model is finished. So if you look at Copilot for Microsoft 365, at the moment it's OpenAI's ChatGPT 4.0 model underneath the hood, basically. That model is fixed and finished. It's running in Microsoft's data centers. The main difference between the public sort of consumer versions, I suppose you could call them, of the OpenAI LLM models and the other ones on the market, the Metas and Googles and all that, and Copilot for Microsoft 365, is that it is augmented by your data in your tenant. So that's the big difference, right? So if you just have a normal ChatGPT subscription and you go, okay, I need to rewrite this report I wrote for my boss last week, you can copy the text out of the report you wrote for your boss last week. You can paste it into ChatGPT and say, rewrite this in a more formal tone and bring in information from this webpage. And it will happily do that for you. But once you close that information is sort of gone, and you manually have to tell the prompt, here is the information I want you to use when you're generating your new output. With Copilot in Microsoft 365, it has access to all the documents you have access to. So not only the report you wrote last week, but the report you wrote last year, as long as it's stored in OneDrive or SharePoint, so that or in Exchange email, I suppose, but don't store your reports in email. But anyway, it can go looking at that information. So it can understand a prompt like, based on my last 3 quarterly reports I've written for the boss, produce a draft for this quarter's report. And it will automatically know where to go and look for those documents, grab that information, and then produce the draft. That's the main difference. It has access to your information in there. And the second thing about the tracking, this is something that's really interesting, because people are worried about data leakage, right? You paste something into the ChatGPT in OpenAI. Where does that information stored? Where does it go? So Microsoft does not look at those prompts that you are using or your users are using when they're interacting with Microsoft 365 Copilot. However, they are being logged. So if you have retention in Microsoft 365 saying that certain things should be deleted after a certain amount of time, you can apply that to Copilot prompts that were recorded when the user did it 3 months ago. You can also apply content search and e-discovery. So like, I don't know, I can't even construct a scenario in my head where this would happen, but, how did this lawyer in my company come up with these citations for this case? Where did he get them from? Did he ask Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365? Let's go and look in the logs, and you can actually see that information. You can track that. So all of that is there in the audit logs, which of course is very different to what you get with a consumer one, because
Right.
outside of your account, you don't have access to any of that. So Microsoft has built a fairly strong governance model around Copilots inside of Microsoft 365. And the same thing for the Copilot in Azure, for example. That's another example.
Right. And this addresses a lot of the major issues that I've seen crop up over the last year about large language models, right? The example that always sticks out to me was, somebody from Samsung, a developer, uploading a bunch of proprietary code into a prompt, right? There was a huge concern there because now proprietary information is somewhere in an open AI data center, right? And they've essentially lost governance of that data, right?
Yep.
So that was always a big concern. And then, of course, all the various bugs that have cropped up in ChatGPT over the last year, surfacing training data. To your point earlier, like you said, they're not taking prompts and then using it to train, right? But at the time of that particular incident, the Samsung incident, it wasn't well known exactly what the case was, right? So I feel like with Copilot, having it focus specifically on your business data kind of alleviates some of those concerns. And then, like you said, being able to tie it into all the other governance features inside of 365, helpful from that perspective as well, too. That said, one big area that has kind of surfaced in some of our conversations and some of our testing with it here in the security lab is it's going to become apparent very quickly for some organizations that they have misconfigured permissions, right? And the reason I say that, the example that comes up is a user puts in a prompt and quickly finds out that, they have access to the accounting share, for example. Hey, show me the salary information. Oh, yeah, it's in this Excel file over here, right? So, it will become very apparent whereas, I guess I can say this, in the old days, right, that user would have to browse out to where the information was, and it wouldn't necessarily be surfaced for them in such an easy fashion, right? So, I know that's the one area that we've been talking a lot about internally. I don't know if you've run across that conversation yourself yet, Paul.
Absolutely. So I've written an article on it, which is probably part of why you and I are having this conversation now. So we'll include that in the show notes below or above or to the side, wherever they go, depending on your platform. So I've written an article on exactly this problem. So seasoned IT pros who were around a few years ago probably remember Delve. So Delve was a Microsoft sort of precursor to, Copilots and stuff, which was basically trawling through documents in your Microsoft 365 tenant and surfacing them to you. So like, hey, I noticed that you're reading these three, balance sheet documents. Here's another one that you might be interested in. So when you'd look in Delve, you'd see these sort of suggested documents for you. Right. And of course, there were a lot of organizations that went, oh, you shouldn't see that document. Whoops. We probably need to go and check our SharePoint permission settings here because we really screwed up. But the big difference here, and between what you were saying before and that in scenario with Delve, is that in Delve, at least, you saw the document name and you could figure out where it came from. And you could go, you shouldn't really have access to it. Nobody in this department should have access to that. Let's go and fix the permissions right now. The difference between that and Copilot is you don't necessarily know where it's going to get the information. If you say, tell me the general trends of salaries at, Contoso, it might go and find that information and go, yeah, here you go. Here's a trend index of, whatever everybody earns. And if you happen to have access to, I hope this isn't happening at a lot of organizations, but it's a good example of what could happen. And now you can just use your imagination across hundreds of other types of information where the SharePoint permissions or the OneDrive permissions have not been configured correctly. And all of a sudden that information is available to you. Because the important thing to stress here is when you're using Copilot, it can only access documents you have access to. So if you have access to the document, Copilot is always on behalf of you. So it will go and look, and if you ask it through a prompt about, I don't know, project defects over the last 6 months, and you have access to wherever that information is stored, it's going to go and find those documents, trawl through them, and give you a summary of the project defects, whether you should have access to that or not, if you have access to those documents.
Right. You know, whenever I'm talking about this stuff, I always look at it from a threat actor perspective as well. If I'm a threat actor and I'm like, oh, hey, look, this user has Copilot enabled. Hey, show me where the crown jewels are, right? I mean, that's a good avenue that a threat actor can take to surface information. And I mean, yeah, that assumes breach, right? But we've been kind of taught lately to assume breach, right? And this brings me to a webinar that I did just last week where I actually demoed an adversary in the middle style of attack using a reverse proxy type of setup to easily capture somebody's M365 username and password and the session token. And I was able to log in without, while bypassing MFA. So, I mean, it's quite easy for threat actors to steal M365 credentials. So, I mean, it's not as common of an issue as like you and I have been talking about so far, Paul, in that misconfigured permissions surfacing data that particular user shouldn't have access to. I mean, certainly it brings up insider threat concerns in some cases. But I just want to bring up the point that, like, hey, if I'm a threat actor and I have access to Copilot, cool. Show me where the goods are, right? So.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I would if I was an attacker. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, definitely. And the other question that I always wind up talking about when we start talking about permissions in 365 is like, how do tenants get this way, right? And to me, it is over time. You think about how easy it is to share things inside of 365. Over time, permissions get relaxed for this business need and relaxed for this business need. And it is very difficult, especially in the modern era, to keep your hands wrapped around your security posture, especially when it comes to file and data access, just because all those reasons that we've talked about in so many episodes of this show, right? And you had a good point that you mentioned before we hit record on this episode, and that is the fact that it's designed, 365 is designed to be easy to share. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think in Zero Trust, we always talk about, least privilege, and that has been part of computer security for the last 50 years or something. And,
right.
And it's really, really hard. It's really hard to do least privilege.
It is.
And whether you're a small business, medium business, or large business, it is really, really hard. And if you're serious about it and you've got some heavy regulation on your back, you really got to do it. You got to have whole teams dedicated to doing it. Because, and the classic one, and I can say this because I've been in IT for nearly 30 years now, the classic one is you can build it like the first day you turn on your Active Directory or your Entra ID, if you're in the cloud nowadays, or your first SharePoint site that you've set up, you can make that gold. If you really put in the effort, day one, it looks great. You come back 6 months later or 12 months later, it's not gold anymore, right? There's all sorts of extra sharing, all sorts of extra things happening, and it's just business. And businesses do not care, or business users do not care, right? They just care about getting their job done.
Right.
And it's such an important point, right? And security professionals all over the world are tearing their hair out and going, why don't they think about security? Why don't they think about security? Because they've got their priorities straight. Unless you've got an organization that has a very strong security culture, you are not going to get fired for messing up some security permissions somewhere or giving somebody too much or sharing with too many people. But you are going to get fired if you consistently don't deliver on time and if you consistently don't get your job done. So people have their priorities right. They just want to keep their jobs and do well and advance and whatever. And that means sharing documents and getting on with it. And as you said, it's built to be really, really easily shared, whether we're talking about internal sharing with just another team or another group of people, whatever, or even external sharing. It's meant to be easy so that everybody can be productive.
Right, exactly. And then we start having this conversation. The other question that always comes up is like, well, why don't I just turn off sharing? You and I have talked about this on this show before, right? You turn off sharing, now you bring a whole shadow IT issue to bear, right? Because people are going to share however they can. It's just, at least if they're doing it via 365, you have some control over the process,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you make it too hard for users, they are now sharing via Gmail accounts or a Google Drive somewhere, or some other cloud storage somewhere that you have no control over. And they're just sharing it anyway. And you don't even know that it's happening until the inevitable data breach happened. And you go, well, where did you get that information? Oh, well, we're storing it over here so we can work from home and work on this team together and whatever. So, yeah. And it's sort of wistfully thinking back, and the old hands in the audience could probably remember this. So 20 years ago, when you were the IT department, you could say, this is how you share documents.
Right.
End of story. This is how you do it. And there was no alternative. Like, very few users were technically competent to figure out anything else. And cloud services were few and far between, and it wasn't easy to set that up. Nowadays, it's so easy. It's so consumer friendly. You may not even need a corporate credit card to make it happen, right? So
Right.
It's a very different world. And thinking that you can apply the I don't know what, Stalin school of locking down people's sharing, that ain't going to fly in 2024, that's for sure.
No,
So,
that's for sure. Which then ultimately brings us to the question of, okay, I want to use Copilot, but my permissions are a rat's nest. I always picture like the comical wiring closet you open and all the cables come falling out, right? That's how permissions are for a lot of organizations. How do they go about fixing this? And the first question I always get is, okay, what about native tools? I'll just go use the native tools to do this. And let me put it this way. So we've got a tool at Hornetsecurity that we designed to solve this problem. And you want to know why we designed it? Because we struggled with this problem ourselves with our own M365 permissions. It was that arduous of a problem. So you've got multiple disparate portals you have to go through, multiple UIs, you've got legacy SharePoint permissions, you've got modern SharePoint permissions, you've got OneDrive settings, you've got retention settings, you've got Teams settings, and there are even some controls that you have to go to the Graph API for, or to just simply answer the question of, what all things does this user have access to? It's very difficult to answer that question using the native tools. It's certainly possible, but it is not easy. And I'm guessing that's probably been your experience too, right, Paul?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's really, really, really difficult. And to me, that just sort of indicates this, what's been happening over the last few years, where productivity and ease of sharing and features that makes it better for information workers to get on with their job has had priority over overall governance. Now, Microsoft is doing a lot of work in data governance, but it's not exactly focused in this area. Right. It's more focused in data loss prevention and information protection. This also has a place to do when it comes with Copilot, because if you have like a sensitive information type label for, I don't know, let's do the US version, social security numbers or credit card numbers, right? So if somebody creates a Word document or an Excel sheet and they put in a bunch of social security numbers, it's going to come up and say, hey, this is sensitive information. You sure you need to store it this way? And if you are, you're going to need to encrypt this document and lock it down. Well, the same controls apply to Copilot. So if you're talking to Copilot and you're saying, hey, I don't know, can you give me a list of all the social security numbers of everybody who works at this company? That's a silly example, but you know what I mean? Like anything that involves that sort of sensitive information, that will be flagged as well. And if it has to go and get a bunch of documents to answer your question, and those documents are labeled with sensitive information types, the output generated information that you're going to put in will also be labeled with the most restrictive label out of the source documents. So again, that's all built in, that governance is there, but that only applies when you're doing purview information protection.
Right.
And in my experience, at least in the small business end of town, they are only starting to nibble at that cake. And from what I hear, even large businesses are struggling with this.
I was going to say, that brings up one thing that you and I have talked about on the show before as well, and that is the fact that when Microsoft sets out to release a new feature, product, they do it with the large enterprises in mind. For this particular case, they're doing it for the organizations that have compliance and governance teams. That's their whole job, right? And like you said, the SMB space is just starting to nibble at this, right? And it's not easy, and it takes resources to do that.
It does, absolutely. And I suppose, again, we're not trying to do a product pitch here, but I do want to point out that permission manager from Hornetsecurity really is a unique product in this space, bringing it all to a single console where you can easily see who's got access to what. You get a to-do list to match up with your policies that you've set for sites, and then and each site can have a different policy, and you can then see where you have gaps. You can go fix those gaps automatically, or if it's a business justification, hey, we're going to accept the risk in this particular one, you can do that. It really is built to help a time-strapped administrator with this very particular problem. To be completely transparent, I do also want to mention that at Ignite end of last year, 2023, Microsoft did release previews of SharePoint Premium. So with additional licensing, you do get something called access reviews for SharePoint sites. Now, it's nowhere near as comprehensive as 365 Permission Manager, but it does allow you to sort of ask the site owner, hey, these 200 people have access to this site. Do they all need it? And then you, as a site owner, can go through and limit that. But again, that's a lot of training for the site owners so that they know what to do and how to do it. But that they are adding some tools in this space. But again, it's a big problem to wrap your head around, and it's also one that I don't think is going to have the priority. If you're an IT team or a security team and you're trying to, balance your resources, where we're going to put our time and effort and energy and dollars, basically, I don't know that it's going to be the highest one on the list, because there's so many other things you want to focus on until some Copilot user in your organization gets access to something they absolutely shouldn't have access to, and they get found out. I mean, it might be you could have this sort of cottage industry of people sharing over the water cooler. Go and ask Copilot about this. It's great. You'll see all this information that you shouldn't have access to. Go and do it. Go and do it now. See what you can see,
Right.
So we might have that sort of scenario until businesses wake up. But data governance is hard. It is not an obvious ROI. Like, it's not like, hey, if we do this, we're going to make the business 5% more efficient and we're going to save money, or blah, blah, blah. None of that's going to happen. So it's going to be an interesting ride, I think, for businesses that start adopting Copilot that don't have their data governance in place. They are going to have an interesting time when it comes to information surfaced to people that shouldn't see it.
For sure. We've actually had a couple of customers test the waters with Copilot, right? And they've actually run a report on a permission manager on the users that they're going to allow test, just to make sure that their permissions are right sized. Because with permission manager, you can say, show me everything in 365 and SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, Teams sites. Show me everything in those areas that Paul has access to. and I can see a comprehensive list of Paul has access to this site, this site, this site, his OneDrive, of course, for example, and all the details associated with that. So I have seen Permission Manager kind of already being used in conjunction with enabling that Copilot license, right?
Mhm.
So that's just one example, right? You get all the other
Yep.
amazing benefits, right? A single pane of glass is probably the biggest one, because I remember my time in the trenches trying to wrap my hands around permissions in SharePoint. It takes me back a little bit. Not modern SharePoint, but older SharePoint. Still, the point stands. It's not easy. I would have killed for a single pane of glass back then, right? So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
Yeah, definitely. So anyway, if you are interested in Permission Manager, just want to check it out. Again, not trying to do a product pitch, but we've talked about it a little bit in this episode. I'll put a link to Permission Manager, again, below this video to the side somewhere. But with that, what do you think, Paul? Should we wrap it up?
I think so. Yeah, it would be interesting to see if we get any feedback on this one. I think it's one of those early stage problems. People are just wrapping their head around using Copilot in their business.
Yep.
And I think there's going to be some interesting times ahead with this for sure.
For sure. And those of you using Copilot, I would love to hear about your experiences, especially your thoughts from a security perspective. You can always email me at andy@hornetsecurity.com. If you have any thoughts on this particular topic, heck, even if you have an episode idea, you're like, hey, Andy and Paul should talk about X, right? Just drop me an email. So anyway, Paul, I want to thank you for spending some time with us again on another episode of the show. Good to have you, my friend.
Likewise. This was great. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, definitely. And those of you watching, I appreciate you spending some time with us today. If you are interested in the show and you found value in it, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, depending on your platform. Again, we're available out on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms. You can also reach us at hornetsecurity.com. And with that, we'll let you go. I appreciate you, again, spending some time with us. Have a great day. Stay safe out there. We'll catch you next week. Have a good one.